Welcome to this class on marketing and tastemakers. It starts the fourth and final section of the course, which is on food and imagination. And today, what I'm going to talk about is the role of marketing in shaping the identity, class, and culture that surrounds a lot of food products. And so I have the course broken into three parts. I want to open a bit with a more theoretical framing about where marketing fits into arguments about society and change, and then talk about two drinks that I think in particular embody some of these interesting ideas about how marketing shapes the connections, the attachments to food products in particular, and how we associate them with class and identity. So the two drinks are wine and coffee. So earlier in the semester, when I was talking about ethical eating, I put up this image of a female shopper that comes from a policy book in the 1980s on nutrition, and it was trying to make sense of the different influences or factors that shape her decision making. And so you can see these external factors, economics, packaging and advertising, and that influence on her, mass media, and then these broader social cultural factors or lifestyles and family. And this image illustrates the way that even individual decision making is framed by these larger macro or collective features. And today I'm going to focus in particular on one, which is, or I should say on one dimension of that, which is marketing, which comes in with packaging and advertising. And packaging and advertising link producers' interests with consumers' interests and concerns. And so it's an intermediary space. Now, in social studies, there is a deep fundamental debate over how much individual autonomy people have and how much is their agency structured and determined by other things external to the individual. And so this is the classic structure-agency debate, or in a different form can be understood as the determinacy-contingency debate. And in the context of food and agriculture, this often shows up, in particular food business, in the debate known as push versus pull narratives. So you'll see different arguments that sometimes some new change in how a food product reaches the market reflects a pull by consumers or a new trend in consumerism, for example, healthy eating. And the argument would be that this interest in healthy eating then creates a demand, and the demand side pressure on producers forces them to start producing more healthy foods, more vegetables, more grains, and oils, less meats, less dairy products, for example. On the other side of the debate, or at least on the other side of explanation, you'll see people who argue that a new change in food has to do with a change in production. Suddenly, with industrial agriculture, we have problems of surplus, large-scale surplus, and the producers have to create demand in order to sell their product, and that could be done in the form of food aid. So, for example, the U.S. food aid program was built out of trying to get rid of surplus U.S. agriculture and send it abroad to needy people for diplomacy, or it could be locally in the context of marketing. If suddenly you have too many tomatoes, then you can try to create a market for things that use tomatoes, like salsa, pizza, hamburgers with tomatoes on them, to get the customer to want to eat this surplus food. So these push versus pull narratives get wrapped up in this question about how much change or choices reflect individual movements that aggregate versus how much they reflect some kind of structural and technological, productive, or economic determinacy. Now, I think this debate is interesting. It's one of the things that fills the pages of scholarly journals, but you also have to take it with a grain of salt because it can quickly become a kind of chicken and egg debate. And this is why I like this quote by James Dusenberry: "Economics is all about how people make choices. Sociology is all about why they don't have any choices to make." And the point he's making is that in these two disciplines, they're aligned around these two poles of structure and agency, and that makes them complementary, but it also puts them in antagonism. one way to get past this dualism or this divide is to look at the people who work in the middle. So again, earlier when I was talking about meat, I talked about how the large scaling up of animal slaughter and the distribution of large quantities of meat started concentrating the power in these middlemen. In the case of the meat market and the packer the meat packer in the early 20th century. In the case of other markets, they would be distributors or manufacturers who were suddenly in between the farmer and the consumer, and were taking advantage of distribution and the logistics as a way of profiting off of this middle zone. And so in this slide, I want to shift that story away from a debate about logistics and towards a debate about how they seek to connect their problem of purchasing from producers to the needs or the interests or the markets of consumers. And the way they did this was by focusing on marketing. Now, there are a wide variety of marketing tricks. You could take a full course looking at the role of marketing and how producers try to get consumers interested in new products. Just to give you a sense that they're creating tools to better understand this, in the 1950s, they started trying to think more formally about what are the different dimensions of a product that we can manipulate or adjust or redesign to draw in new markets. And so in 1953, Neil Borden coined this term marketing mix. And here on this diagram, you can see that what was known as the 4 Ps, and this is still used in many marketing classes, although there are newer variations. The 4 Ps were product, price, promotion, and place. Product being innovations in packaging and brand. So create a new brand, build loyalty around that brand, create a new kind of package to get people using the food in a different way. Price, in the sense that you could have coupons and sales or discounts to get interest in a new product, or to draw a lower economic class of interest into the product. Place could be the situation in the supermarket, how you classify the product in different kind of categories and where you would find it. Is this a cereal? Is this a health product? And finally, promotion, which we're familiar with in the form of advertising, and then salespersons or sales force. So marketing is a set of techniques that we can use, or that producers use to try to attract consumers to what they have to sell. In this sense, it's a kind of mediating force, but it isn't that they simply create demand out of nothing. There is a kind of cultural dimension to how people understand this. And when you look at foods, some foods lend itself to some types of marketing, and other foods to other types of marketing. And the examples I like to compare the best are between Coca-Cola and wine. So if you look at Coca-Cola and wine, we often think of them as very different types of drink. How you would describe Coca-Cola or the kind of marketing profile you'd have around it, it might hear words of it being described as refreshing, sort of fun, usually happy in an unpretentious kind of way, in a similar sense, democratic. Everybody wants to have Coca-Cola sometimes, obviously targeted towards kids. Similarly, it's a global product. It's the same globally. So if you think about my lecture on accounting for scale, this is something like the Big Mac that has been designed to be the same everywhere in the world with minor variations. And because of this, it's familiar. If I talk about Coca-Cola, I know that taste is a particular thing. I wouldn't talk about Coca-Cola in one country, Coca-Cola in another, usually, with the exception, I know, of sugar and corn syrup. Now, wine, on the other hand, has this personality in the marketing of being a bold, complex drink. Again, the marketing around wine is usually focused on some kind of sophistication. In this sense, there is variation. It tends to be local, so you'd want to know where the wine is from. Having some obscure understanding of it. Unlike Coke, where everyone knows it, if I recognize an obscure wine, somehow this adds to the cachet and the value of it. Now, this has consequences for how the two are marketed. Coca-Cola is trying to market to a mass market and a mass economy. It has these campaigns centered in kind of global ways, branding and familiarity. Wine is all about diversification, creating special labels that capture a kind of literate consumer's attention, and building an attention to taste and variation in taste. And here I mean taste in both senses. Taste in the sense used culturally to mean I have good taste, what I like is positive, is attractive, reflects that I have sort of conspicuous consumption and some kind of status, and also taste in the literal sense. You have to cultivate a sense that there's this different complicated flavor complex to the wine, and therefore it takes education to learn how to appreciate it. Now, the reason I put these two drinks next to each other is because a certain class of consumer looks at Coca-Cola and says, oh, Coca-Cola, this is for kids, it's unhealthy, it's an unsophisticated drink. And then they might turn and say, wine, on the other hand, is great, it's good for your health. And this is ironic because in many ways, there are ways of comparing the two where they're very similar. Both are very high in sugar. In fact, when I have friends who complain about Coca-Cola at a party, but then I see them drinking red wine, I point out to them, ironically, red wine has lots of calories. So if you're concerned about calorie counting, it's actually higher per 100 milliliters than Coca-Cola. But yet, we associate Coca-Cola now with the new health movement as being this kind of gourmands thing. Some people who don't have good restraint and self-control drinking Coca-Cola when they should be having something healthier. And in contrast, the wine is for the gourmet. So the gourmand is the person who eats food excessively, loves eating and drinking in quantity, and the gourmet, in contrast, is the connoisseur, the person who wants to eat quality food and be focused on that. So to wrap up this first section on this kind of more theoretical looking at the framing of taste and marketing, the classic expression is there is no accounting for taste. That somehow some people like one thing, other people like another thing. In reality today, you can study techniques that steer or guide or nudge people towards particular kinds of interest and taste. And there are different fields of expertise that attempt to do this. Marketing is one, and so I'm going to talk about some of the marketing techniques that are used with wine and coffee. But in this last slide here, you can see an argument by a historian of science, Steve Shapen, where he talks about the sciences of subjectivity. And what he means by this is that there are sciences developed to standardize understandings of taste. In this image, you can see a UC Davis wine aroma wheel. And what this is designed to do, according to the architects, is to facilitate communication about wine flavor by providing a standard terminology. If we can agree that on how we talk about wine, we can create communities around this. And so these tools for standardizing taste then become an opportunity for developing consensus, creating a social life around the product. Now, not ironically, but actually quite strategically, marketing draws upon this. So marketing has incorporated many of these tools as well to raise the profile of some kind of product by trying to encourage the users with education to see it in a more complicated way. And this becomes an opportunity to sell more products.